Today, we're going to be talking all about testing and developing GraphQL APIs. I wanted to take this time to introduce myself. My name is Pooja Mistry. I am a developer advocate here at Postman, and I'm really excited to be sharing today's session with you. And I'm joined by my awesome colleague, Debo. Debo, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi everyone, it's a pleasure being here today with everyone. I am Debo. I work as a developer relations engineer on the same team as Pooja at Postman.
Awesome. Yeah. So before we get started, we want to kind of get to know a little bit about you as well. And then we'll give a little GraphQL overview, and we'll show you how to work with GraphQL using Postman, and we'll share some resources, and we'll wrap up with some questions and answers. But if you have some questions along the way, be sure to add them in the Q&A panel at the bottom. So that way we can get your questions answered from our panelists as well during the session. So now that you know a little bit about us, I'd love to do a poll to learn a little bit more about you as well. So I'm going to go ahead and launch this poll. And I wanted to kind of get a little bit more understanding of how much experience you might have with Postman, or if you consider yourself an API producer or an API consumer. So I think I just launched that poll, and I'm going to wait for some of our participants to answer before I share. But it looks like what I'm seeing is that a lot of you all are fairly new to Postman, have been using it for a little less than 6 months. Some of you have been using it for 1 to 3 years. And I think majority of you all are consider yourself consumers of APIs compared to producers. So that's definitely interesting. So let me go ahead and end that poll. So you all are here to learn a little bit more about GraphQL. And I wanted to kind of talk to you about GraphQL because it's a relatively new type of format of creating APIs. So if you don't know the GraphQL story, in 2012, the Facebook created a GraphQL iOS project, and it was used for the newsfeed API. And so since then, in 2015, the GraphQL publication was released. And then in 2016 is where the public GraphQL API was made, and GitHub was one of the first to create a GraphQL API in the schema. And then by 2019, there was a whole GraphQL foundation. So with GraphQL being relatively new, a new way, we've kind of come a long way in 2023 to where we are with GraphQL. And Postman has actually come quite a long way as well when it comes to GraphQL. So if you're interested in learning a little bit more about the GraphQL story, our moderators can share in the chat a blog, which is what is GraphQL, and it's all about the Facebook years and what the problem was and how the team decided to create such a application. So be sure to learn a little bit more about that. But essentially, what is GraphQL? So GraphQL is a query language, and it basically empowers the clients to retrieve the data that they want to retrieve without overfetching or underfetching. So essentially, it uses one single endpoint, unlike REST APIs or other APIs, and you basically get all of your data back in a single endpoint, and it is used for more efficient development. So what I've seen is that GraphQL has been used a little bit more for front-end teams and back-end teams to work a little bit more internally when it comes to working with their APIs, to get the exact data that they need without sending multiple different API requests. So if you're interested a little bit more, I have another link that I wanted to share you, which is our GraphQL open technology specifications. that if you're interested to learn a little bit more about the GraphQL query team, within Postman, we have a team that provides a lot of interesting GraphQL resources in terms of working with GraphQL. So with that, I wanted to have Debo talk a little bit about GraphQL operations. Debo?
Yes. Yeah, so we have, like Pooja has explained and gone through like the overview of what GraphQL is. Similar to like other forms of building APIs, like building REST APIs, for example, we have like different operations in GraphQL, and we primarily have like three of them. There are queries, there are mutations, and there are subscriptions. So, when working with APIs, you're exchanging data, you're sending data through one medium, but you're also like querying data from like a database or a data source. So like queries are just ways of actually fetching data. Think of it like a GET request when working with REST APIs, where you're just getting data from a specific data source, which could be a database. Well, mutation sounds just like the name. It's used for mutating data. Think of it like making GET or PUT requests when working with REST APIs, where you're actually mutating data in the database. So it could be you creating a new account or you updating a user account or something, but you're actually like mutating data. Then there are subscriptions, which is a way for the client side and the server side to establish a bi-directional communication whereby the clients can emit events to the server side and the server side can also like respond to that and emit events to the client side. So it's not just the client requesting data from the server side, but the server side could also request data from the client side. So think of it like WebSocket.
Yeah.
In fact, I guess I've been mentioning REST and GraphQL a couple of times. Yeah,
Definitely.
it's like that brings me to wanting to like talk about what then is the difference between like REST APIs and GraphQL APIs. I'll be focusing on some of like the major differences and not talk too much about that. But the prominent one, which you'd initially notice, is that for REST APIs, you have multiple endpoints, you have multiple routes, and each of those routes have like their different parameters, their request body, and whatnot. But for GraphQL, you have one single entry point to the API. So there's just one endpoint, regardless of how many operations you want to perform. So for REST APIs, you sort of have like a fixed response structure. So if you're creating a user account, you always get like the same response regardless of who is making that call, right? So far as it's a successful API call. But with GraphQL, you can sort of be like flexible with the responses you're getting because it is definitive in nature, whereby you sort of like define exactly the data you want from that response. So it sort of prevents overfetching and underfetching, where you're saying, I want just the name and the email and nothing else, and the server is going to return that to you. There's also like you handling versioning and the complexity around that, where for like REST APIs, because it has like multiple endpoints, you have to like handle versioning across all of those endpoints. Whereas with GraphQL, you have just one single endpoint and you only have server and versioning on that one single endpoint.
Awesome. Yeah. And we actually have an interesting blog as well I wanted to share, Debo.
Yeah.
So just let me just try to see if I can pull that up real quick. But yeah, so we have a blog that shows the differences between REST, GraphQL, gRPC, and SOAP. So if you're interested in learning a little bit more in terms of like the differences of the different architecture styles, feel free to take a look at that blog as well. Awesome. So let's go ahead and jump to the next session. So yeah, I think Debo might need to refresh, but let's start and let's jump right in and get into working with GraphQL within Postman. So I'm going to share this tiny URL GraphQL Postman link. So I think our moderators can share that in the chat. So if we take a look at that link, what that gets us to is the publish Postman templates. So we have a GraphQL service. It's an echo service that basically talks through some of the operations that we talked about earlier: queries, mutations, subscriptions. So if you're interested in working with this with Postman's GraphQL service, you'll get a more deeper insight on how to work with GraphQL within Postman as well. So you can go ahead and fork this particular collection into any of your workspaces, and you should be able to get started. But we're going to start from scratch here and show you how to work with GraphQL and how to make your first requests. So what we're going to do here is we're going to take a look at making your first request with GraphQL client. And so we have some documentation as well that we wanted to share, but essentially here we talk about queries, mutations, and subscriptions, and I'm going to show you how to make a GraphQL query with Postman. So today we're going to use this graphql.postman.echo.com endpoint, and this is going to load the GraphQL schema using introspection. So here I have an empty workspace, I have empty collection, and I'm going to start completely from scratch when it comes to working with GraphQL. So let me go ahead and click on new, and I'll create a GraphQL request. I can add my endpoint here, and you can see that, let's see. I'm going to first save this. Well, hold on. I wanted to show you. I don't know if it's
the responses tab is a little high up, so you have to like drag it down.
Move it down. Yeah.
Yeah.
Isn't going down though. Oh, hold on. Maybe I zoomed in too much. Okay, yeah, I think I zoomed in.
Yeah.
All right, let me try
you zoomed in too much.
Let me try that again. So, all right, so now that I put that endpoint in, you can see that my schema is loaded automatically using introspection. You can see that I have like my query here available. I have mutations, I have subscriptions. So I wanted to just show you an example of using a query. So let's take a look at this query, which is a query for hello. And I'm going to go ahead and click on query, and you can see that I get my response code, I get the data back. I can use certain fields like person. I can add like the fields in here. I can add static fields and here as well. And then when I save this, I can save this as a query example, and I can create a specific collection called the GraphQL collection. And so Debo and I are actually on the same team, so we can work hand in hand with one another. And so when I have saved this query, he can take a look at the same on his side as well. And we're going to be switching screens to show you how we're both able to work with our collection hand in hand. So essentially, once we have that query, I wanted to show you, since this is the Echo GraphQL query, it basically sends you any data that you send it. Similar to our Echo REST API, it's the same thing for Echo for our GraphQL. So this is a great endpoint just for testing purposes and for learning purposes. But let's take a look at something a little bit more interesting. So I'm going to duplicate this example, and I'm going to put in another URL. So for those of you who are Rick and Morty fans, we have a GraphQL Rick and Morty API endpoint. So I'm going to go ahead and add that. And if I refresh that, you can see that since this is using introspection, I can get the query automatically here. So, and the interesting thing about this GraphQL client that's new is that since your query shows up right once you are fetching the data from introspection, you can see your data dynamically as as you basically load the URL. So here I have the entirety of the data, for example, like episodes. I can take a look at characters, and I can query and get some data. And so this is, you can get certain, based on what kind of request you send, you can get certain types of data back. And I believe that this particular example should result in any sort of data that you particularly get back from this particular ID. So I think I might need some sort of authorization for this. So let's just try characters. So must have a subfield. Okay, so let's add maybe a page or a filter status. Let's try to see if that works. Oh, it might not, but regardless, you can get your data back and query for your data that way. And the other way to work with GraphQL is that you can work with introspection. However, you can also load your schema using GraphQL. So here I have a public schema from GitHub. So for example, if my introspection was not set up, I can alternatively basically import my schema using introspection. So if I wanted to go ahead and import my schema, and I have this particular schema on my desktop, if I take a look at the GraphQL API, which should be the GitHub GraphQL API. I'm just going to see if I can query it. And I can see that I get the GitHub queries available as well. So all I would need is the GitHub GraphQL endpoint to get started working with a schema that I have imported. So that's an example to show how to import your schema as well. So with queries, you can get your data. So think of this as a GET request. And then if your introspection is set up, you should be able to fetch your data automatically. And then of course you can go ahead and import your schema. So I'm going to hand it off to Debo to talk a little bit more about mutations. So let's go. I'm going to have him share his screen there.
Yeah, Upuja has gone over querying data, but I'm going to go over like the second operation that we talked about initially, which is mutations. So what I'm just going to do here is I could just duplicate one of this request that Pooja has made and rename this as mutation example instead of query. You could also do this hello query that Pooja made in the old request that I duplicated. And I can see that I have a bunch of mutations here. I have the create person mutation. And if I check this, I can see that it's automatically populating the schema for that on the right-hand side. And here I could see that the person input, for this person input, it has a name field. I could put Pooja's name here, the age, I could use age 60. There's an ID field that it returns a name field, as an age field. Now remember what I was saying about GraphQL returning exactly what you wanted. So if I didn't want the name field, I could uncheck this. And when I hit this query, you could see that it's returning a bunch of data, which exclude the name. Clicking the name field also includes that as well. So that's just like a very basic example of how you like work with like mutations in GraphQL. But oftentimes when you're like mutating, right, you want to pass in variables. You want to work with something called GraphQL variables. So we have like this variable tab at the bottom here that allows you to declare variables you want to work with. Say peradventure, I want the name to be dynamic, for example. This Pooja name, I want to declare it as a variable here. I could do that by passing an object here. I could call this name, and I could use like the same way you declare a variable in Postman using two calling braces. But for now, let me just make that a string for this example. I could also make the age a variable. Then I could use a different age. Let me use a different name so you see that it's working. I could use Ian as my name, age 50. And here in GraphQL, when you want to declare a variable, when you want to use a variable, the first thing you have to do is to declare that variable. So I'm declaring the variable here, and you also have to like declare the type of that variable. I'm saying the name is a string, and there's also age, and then I'm saying the age is an integer, and the exclamation mark in front is just signifying that it is a required field. So here, instead of just using the name directly, I could say and name here. And for the age, instead of using 60 directly, I could just do this here. And now I've declared both the name and the age here. And when I run this query, you can see that I'm getting the name Ian and I'm getting the age 50. But this is you working with GraphQL variables, right? What if you want to like programmatically modify these variables the way you're able to do in pre-request and test scripts when working with like REST APIs? You know, the first example I gave them was using curly braces as variables. So you could also do the same thing here. And you know, in Postman, we have like some fixed variables that you could take advantage of. We could do and random full name for the name and run this. And you'd see that each time I run this request, I'm getting a new random full name here as the variable. But this is just a random full name. Yeah, go ahead, Pooja.
Yeah, I just wanted to let everyone know if both for those of you who aren't aware, with Postman, we have a lot of inbuilt libraries. So the random variables right there is an inbuilt Postman library that you can use with any collection and request. So you can work with random names, addresses, ints, colors. So for those of you using it for testing purposes, it's very useful in that regard. So yeah.
Yeah, it's very useful in that regard. For those of us who are like familiar with JavaScript, think of it like Faker.js, where you're using it to like generate like user data and whatnot. So we have like a bunch of other ones aside from like the full name. But if you also want to use like a variable declared before, I could just use the name directly here. And here I could use the age directly here. So now I'm calling to these two variables. I'm going to save this, but I need to declare this variable somewhere, right? And you know, like Postman, we have the concept of collection variables, environment variables, and global variables. So I'm going to be declaring this as a collection variable. I'll declare a variable name. I'll use an entirely different name. I could use my name. Then I'll use age. I could use 100 years here. Then I'm going to save this collection variable. Now, when I go back to my mutation example, when I run this mutation, you notice that here I'm having the age I declared, and I'm also having the name that I have specified the data. And those are like declared in collection variables here. But what if I want to programmatically modify these variables? Say peradventure, I want to like do some processing on my request body before I make a call to this mutation, if I make this mutation call, or peradventure, I want to like write a bunch of tests against the response I'm getting back from this API call. We could do that with the script start here. So you know the way we have the concept of pre-request and test scripts when working with like REST APIs and Postman. Yeah, we have the concept of before query and after response, which actually does the same thing, right? Before query runs exactly before the query is sent, while after response runs immediately after a response is gotten back from that API call. So in the before query here, we have like snippets that can help you like get things done fast. So I could just set a collection variable, and I know that the key for my collection variable is name. I could give this a different value entirely. I could give this the name Eric, and I'm going to save this. And when I run this request, you can see that I've programmatically modified the collection variable here, and it's going to use that variable in my request. So when I query this, I am going to get the name Eric back. Now I could do exactly the same thing for the age as well, and any other data that I want to modify. So just to like go over that again, the first thing I did was I declared GraphQL variables and their type, and I called those variables in my inputs. You notice that the input here, I could also like type in those values here. by myself, and then I declared like sort of like GraphQL variables. Now we're using collection variables to dynamically pass variables into it, like the GraphQL variables here, which is why I went ahead to create a variable in my collection and in my per request script or in my before query script, I am modifying that variable. But similarly, you could do the same thing for the after response scripts where you can test if a query is successful. So I'm just using the snippets here. And you could also check if like a specific error exists or if the response time is below 200 milliseconds. So I'm just going to send this. And you can see now that I have two tests. One is failing. I click on that. I can see that the query is successful, but I do not get a response under 200 milliseconds. So I could just make this like like 2000 milliseconds and send that query again. And now you can see that it's passing because I am getting like a response under 2000 milliseconds. So that's basically how you work with mutations, how you can work with like dynamic data, either with mutations or query. If you're working with a query, it's the same process. If you want to like make some of like your variables dynamic, or you want to like programmatically modify some of the parameters you're working with in GraphQL, especially the input parameters. So yeah, that's that about like working with mutations and scripts. I'll pass it on to Pooja to talk about working with subscriptions.
Awesome. Yeah. So let me go ahead and share my screen again. So I'll take a look at here. So we're going to be talking about the last operation, which is subscription. So let me go ahead and I'll duplicate this and let's call this subscription example. All right. So I'm going to let me just see. I know that this is Debo's query. So I'm going to just keep that here and I'm going to hide both the query and mutation. And let's take a look at this subscription. So when I take a look at this subscription, I also wanted you all to notice that you can have multiple different operations in a single query. So here I also have the create person operation, which is the operation that Debo just created, as well as the subscription operation, which is for greeting. So let me just hide the variables here just so that we can take a look at what the subscriptions for greetings looks like. So I'm going to go ahead and query that. So similarly to getting data as if it was a WebSocket, we can take a look at all of the data that we are getting back from hitting that greetings subscription, which basically returns a stream of hellos. So it's interesting because you can get the data that you're getting back, and you can also filter by the data. You can filter all of your messages all by responses, and you can also clear messages here. And so with that, those are the three major operations that we've used. So with subscriptions, if you have a subscription set up, it's works similarly to streaming the data. Mutations is all about creating data. So consider this similar to your post request. And then queries is all about reading and getting the data back. So those are the three operations that you can perform with GraphQL using Postman, especially if you have your introspection created. And then, of course, working with scripts and before and after scripts. So now that you've learned a little bit about calling GraphQL requests and also testing them using scripts, you might be wondering, how do I create GraphQL schemas from scratch? So within Postman, not only do we have the ability to work with the collections, but we have also the ability to work with APIs. And actually, I think Debo was going to share how to go about building a GraphQL API. So I'm going to hand it off a little bit over to him so he can share that as well.
Yeah. So GraphQL uses like something called like GraphQL schemas. We call it an SDL, the schema definition language. And we know that like in Postman, there's an API tab that allows you to author schemas like the Open API. You could also offer GraphQL schemas, similar to how you could offer Open API schemas in Postman. So on the left navigation tab here, if you do not already see an APIs tab, like here now, there's no APIs tab. There's this option here that allows you to configure your workspace sidebar. If you click that option, you can see that you can control what you're seeing on your workspace sidebar here. I could choose to toggle off collections, and that would be toggled off. I could toggle it on back. So similarly, I could toggle on the APIs tab, and now the APIs tab is coming up. So if I click that, I could see that, yeah, I do not already have any APIs, but I can create a new API. I'll hold on for this to be created. And now there's a new API that has been created. So I'll just rename this to GraphQL API. Then clicking on this, I can import or create a new schema definition. So I'll just create a new schema definition. Now there's like multiple definition types that we support. We support Async API, Open API. I'm going to be selecting GraphQL, and I want to use the schema definition language. It could also be authored in JSON, but the schema definition language is like the most popular way of authoring GraphQL schemas. Then I have an option of starting from a boilerplate schema, which I'm going to use. So I'm just going to create that definition. Now you can see that I have an index.graphql file here, and I have some schemas that have been auto-populated for me. Now this schema here just allows query, mutation, and subscriptions. Those are like the three things it contains. And then we have the concept of GraphQL, where you can create like a type for a data entity. Now you see that here we have a type user. We also have a type of query. We have a type of mutation. Similarly, you can have a type of subscription. Here we have like a type of query, and we can see that here we have one single query for fetching a user using the ID of the user, and the ID of the user is presented as a string. Similarly, for mutation, we have one single mutation for adding a user. You can think of this like create user. I could just rename that to create user for clarity. Now you can see that when you're creating a user, you can provide the name of that user. But there's a bunch of other information you could include as well aside from the name. You could choose to collect the email of that user, which should be a string and it should be required. You could request for the age, which should be an integer. You can choose to make that optional in case people are not comfortable sharing their age. You could request for a password, for example, which should be a string and should be required. Then like I've declared a bunch of new parameters that you're requesting for like a user. It makes sense to modify the user object to include all of those parameters. So I'm just going to copy this over here. So now all of this authoring like the schema this way is done on the server side. And on the client side, you can also like alter like the client side schema to sort of define the inputs data you're giving to that mutation and the specific data you want to query.
And then
so I have like
the exclamation point is also required arguments, correct?
Yeah, that's correct. This also signifies that this is a required field. So for required field, if it's an input, if this ID is required here, it means when someone is making this user query, they have to provide an ID unless it's going to fail. And from the response, it means while you're writing something called resolvers for like these queries, it has to return the required field. So for example, if name is required, it means you always have to return the name from the server side. If email is required, it means you always have to return the email. But of course, on the client side, you can choose exactly what you want to query. So you can choose to query name and not email, even though the email is required. Yeah, so now that we have like this defined here, I could go back to my collection and sort of show how you can import the schema that you defined in the API builder into your collection here. So I'm going to create a new GraphQL request, and I'm going to save this so I can save it to that collection. I'll name this GraphQL from schema. I'll save it in this GraphQL collection. Now I have this GraphQL from schema request, and you could see that here I have multiple options. One other thing that I wanted to mention was you could provide different form of authorization, similar to how you could do with REST APIs here. We have bearer tokens, OAuth 2.0, OAuth 1.0, API keys, and you could also provide like necessary request headers that are needed for like authorization. But we also have the schema tab here, where you could select an API, and you can see that I have that API that I just created listed here, GraphQL APIs. Now, if I have multiple APIs in my API builder, it is going to list out all of those different API, and I can select which of it I want. So I could just select GraphQL API. You can see that it's loading, and when it's done loading, I'm just going to hold on for this to be done loading. Now it has loaded like this GraphQL API. So I can navigate back to my queries tab, and you can see that the query I defined, which is the user query, is here. The mutation I defined, which is the create user mutation, is here. You could also see that it has to return this user type, which is required because of the exclamation mark in front of it. You can see all of the fields are declared: name, email, age, password. And I could just toggle this create user mutation, and you can see that all of that is populated here for me. The schema is already written. I could do the same thing for the query, for the create user query, and you can see that all of that is populated from here. And similarly, you can see that I have both a mutation and a query, and it's sort of highlighting the one that is currently active, which means if I run this, it's going to send the active request. And if I click on like this drop down here, I could select which one I want to be active and which one I do not want to be active. But because this is not an actual API that we built, this is just a schema that we've authored in the API builder. There is no base URL or endpoints for that. So if I run this, it's not going to go through.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, I mean, the use case here would be for anyone who's interested in designing their schema. If they use the API builder from Postman, you can see how your API is designed using the query builder as well. So it makes it a lot easier to know what your query is going to look like once it's finally designed. So I think that's a pretty cool use case as well. Yeah, and I feel like this was pretty intensive. We've went through a couple of different examples of query, mutation, subscription. We showed you how to work with different ways to import, whether you want to create an API directly in Postman and import it that way, or import it externally. And so I wanted to just share, is there anything else you wanted to share, Deepo, before we move on?
Yeah, I think we've really pretty much covered most of the things. And I think one thing that's like interesting about authoring your own schema in the API builder is if you're working like on the server side and you're authoring the schema, it just makes it easy for you to generate a collection from that schema and share that with the developers that are working on the client side. So it makes it easy for you to like work faster and sort of like collaborate where they can start working with that collection as you're building that API. So yeah, it's a really cool feature.
Yeah, and we have a little bit extra time left. I wanted to I guess play around with a query that I wasn't able to get a little bit earlier, but I'm working with the Rick and Morty API here, and we're able to get, this is the data that we're able to get back from this query. So for example, we're getting some results back. We're getting the name of all of the characters back. So depending on which field you select, like for example, if I wanted to select the status field, I can get the data of the status of each character when I click on that query, and I can see, which character is dead or alive, which is kind of fun. So it's interesting how, I guess, like the beauty of GraphQL is, if I wanted to, if I was doing this in REST, I'd have to send multiple endpoints to get this data, correct? But with GraphQL, I have a single endpoint, and I can run a query as well as run a query to get so much data back. So you can kind of see that it works on that level of performance. So any thoughts you wanted to share there? GraphQL versus REST, Debo?
Yeah, I think the single endpoint thing just makes it very easy to work with, whereby you do not have to like make multiple API calls to do like multiple things. So you could sort of like make multiple queries in one single traffic to the server. So if you wanted to like query two things at the same time, um instead of like having to like make one request to one endpoint, then another request to another endpoint, or if you, for example, you wanted to like, I'm trying to think of like the perfect example of where you want to like send two or three queries at the same time. But yeah, that's like possible. So if you wanted to like fetch user data, for example, you wanted to fetch the user profile while at the same time fetching transactions of that user, you could do that like all in one single query over just one transport to like the server, as opposed to having to like make multiple API calls to do that.
Yeah, and I like that you can see it in two different views. Like, for example, you can see it in the JSON format view and also like the table view of the data that you're querying as well. So that's a easier way to kind of take a look at your data. So we have a good amount of time left. I think the last few things I wanted to share before we end for today is I wanted to talk a little bit about Postman joining the GraphQL Foundation. So Postman recently joined the GraphQL Foundation. So we actually have a blog about that. So we have an entire team at Postman that is dedicated to keeping up with all things that are happening in GraphQL. And I believe this recently, we've always had GraphQL within our Postman ecosystem, but this new Postman client has allowed you to work with GraphQL in much more dynamic, intuitive way. So I think we will have some moderators add the link to that blog. But essentially, this blog kind of showcases our commitment to GraphQL and the GraphQL community and working in the Postman, ensuring that we're meeting our standards as well as staying on top of all things that are happening in the community there. And so let's see. So we have a couple of more things before we get started. I think before we finish up, I think the last thing that we wanted to share is all of our additional resources. So if I can get some of the panelists to talk, send some links to the GraphQL Foundation, as well as some of our resources. But some of our resources here is that you are all subscribed to Intergalactic. I wanted to share the community forum, which is a very dynamic place for anyone to ask any questions if they want to have any questions working with GraphQL. And then, of course, we have our quick starts, which allow you to learn about learn about all things that are happening at Postman as well. And then we have some workspaces, the Postman Answers workspace as well, which shows kind of how to work with Postman in different ways. So I think we had a question about where one can find GraphQL collections. So I believe I showed the published Postman templates here. So this is where you can get the GraphQL Echo collection that we worked with today. But of course, you can always search GraphQL in all of Postman, and you should be able to find some interesting collections by either the DevRel team, where we have working with GraphQL examples, and then also within our publish Postman templates is also a great place to kind of learn a little bit more about GraphQL. And then I just wanted to I have a couple more questions. So who uses GraphQL in majority? Is it QA or is it developers? Debo, do you have any thoughts on GraphQL usage?
Well, I think basically GraphQL can be used to like build different kinds of API. Either you are like doing QA or like you're like a regular developer. Of course, I know like developers have like can be very opinionated and have like their own sort of like preference and use cases. But for example, like the example you gave where Facebook was working on like their what was it again? I think they're like feeds API, and they were sort of like having like the issue of overfetching, where perhaps with like GraphQL, it sort of like eradicated that issue completely. So I'd say one, it's a matter of preference. There are cases for places where you'd use a REST API and a GraphQL API would perfectly work in such cases. So GraphQL solves actually, it solves very valid problems, but then it boils down to like the person working with like the GraphQL API, what they intend to achieve, and what sort of like API they're looking to build.
Yeah. And I think like I believe that, would you say that REST is more used like as public APIs versus like GraphQL is more internal APIs?
Well, I wouldn't say that because people build like I mean, GitHub's API, GitHub has like a GraphQL API that's a public facing API. There are a lot of other companies that have like public facing APIs that are GraphQL APIs as well. So I wouldn't say people use GraphQL for internal APIs and REST for external APIs. Um, so it sort of really depends, right? I mean, for like internal APIs, perhaps communicating between like microservices and whatnot, if we're perhaps talking about perhaps like event-driven architectures and using that for microservice communication, it's different. But for GraphQL, I would say it's a mix of both. Again, it depends on like the specific team, what they intend to achieve with like the API. But I don't think GraphQL was specifically engineered for, say, you should only use it for public-facing APIs, or you should only use it for like internal APIs.
Yeah, definitely. And
Yeah.
I think someone had mentioned that REST is still about 90% of the API market, whereas like GraphQL is definitely gaining popularity. So I think for me, I feel like I do love the qualities of how much data you can get back with a single endpoint. So I find that very useful in certain ways. But we've also had a lot of questions for those of you who are Postman users for a long time. We've had a lot of questions about collection runner and using GraphQL. So I know that right now that feature isn't a part of the GraphQL client that we have available, but we hope that it becomes that. But I think the reason why I believe is that right now we have GraphQL WebSocket requests, gRPC requests, all of those requests are considered asynchronous requests, correct? And so right now we don't support like a way to run multiple like collection runner queries. So
And the GraphQL client is relatively new in Postman. I think we just rolled it out, I think was it earlier this year? So there's still like a lot of improvements being made to it, which is where your feedback comes in, right? We value like feedback from like the community. If like the moderators could help like share a link to where you could like submit a feedback on what feature you'd like to see in the GraphQL client, or what you think is currently missing from the client, because we just rolled out the client, so there's still a lot more coming to like the GraphQL clients generally, and eventually it's going to like support all of these different features. Like,
yeah, definitely. Awesome.
So there was also.
I don't know if there are any questions. We have a little bit more time. I'm just going to take a look at Subscriptions.
There was also
Yeah, go
one
ahead.
question, I think around, I think there was one other question around pagination.
Mhm.
So you could paginate data in GraphQL similar to the way you paginate data when working with REST APIs. I know like in terms of like APIs, there are like different types of paginations. I do not know the names of all the types of different pagination off the top of my head, but the two like prominent ones that I think I know are like page-based pagination and offset-based pagination, where you sort of like provide like a page and per page or something, where the page signifies the page you're currently on, and the per page signifies, oh, I want to get like 10 data for every page. So if you're like on the third page, you know that's 10 data for every page. That's like 3 times 3, that's like 3 times 10, that's like on you're getting like the next 40 data. And there's like the offset-based pagination, which also works with GraphQL. I do not have like an API to like sort of like show examples of those different kinds of pagination right now. But for like offset page pagination, you're sort of like having like an offset and a limit where you're saying offset 10 data and give me the next 20 data, which the next 20 data is like the limit. So you say offset of 10, limit of like 20. So there's also that kind of pagination. So really the different kinds of pagination that you can work with REST APIs and other kind of APIs are the same kind of pagination that you can work with GraphQL APIs. I know there's also like node-based pagination. I don't know if that's the correct name for it, but really you can work efficiently with pagination in GraphQLs.
Yeah. And I think we have one question about like what is the most challenging experience when you start working with GraphQL. So if you're interested in getting started with GraphQL and you're brand new to it, one of the easiest way to get started is, of course, forking GraphQL Echo and starting from there. But we have a lot of documentation. So for example, within our Learning Center, we have a documentation on the GraphQL overview, and you can take a look at overview of like working with queries, mutation subscriptions. You can take a look at working with the GraphQL client as well, and then using the GraphQL interface. So I think we went through it a little bit more in detail today, but if you're interested in working and getting started with GraphQL, I'm going to just add this link in the chat for those who might be interested in kind of getting started with GraphQL there. But to get started, if you have a collection, you can just create a GraphQL request, and if your schema uses introspection, it should load automatically. And if it doesn't, then you might need to import that schema, as we showed a little bit before. So yeah, we have an interesting question about where do we see GraphQL in the next 10 years in terms of usage. I think that's a really interesting question. I feel like it's still very relatively new and it's getting ramped up a little bit more, but what are your thoughts, Debo?
Yeah, well, I believe technology is meant to evolve. Where would it be the next 10 years? I do not know for sure. What I do know, it's going to be very much different from what it is right now, considering the amount of investment, dedication, and the kind of team that has been actively working on like GraphQL for the past couple of years. And in all honesty, I feel like the growth of GraphQL just was sort of like linear at first, like 2012. And when the GraphQL Foundation came, it just sort of became exponential. And all of a sudden, everyone is building with like GraphQL APIs and whatnot. Um, so yeah, I definitely think GraphQL is going to be like in a much more better place than it currently is in the next 10 years. How widely adopted it is going to be by then, I do not know. If there's going to be some new technology that we'll be using that perhaps solves like a different kind of problem and would then be like the mainstream one. Well, I would say for sure we can't really say 10 years is like a very long time from now. I guess what I would like to know is what the vision of the GraphQL team is and where would they like to like be in like the next 10 years. That would be like interesting to know as well.
Yeah. Yep. So we have about like 4 more minutes left, and I think we've shared quite a few different resources. Let me just pull up Postman Quick Starts just so those of you who are interested. So Postman's Quick Starts is a really great way for anybody to get started with Postman. So we have the 15 days of Postman for testers. We have the 30 days of Postman for developers. So for those of you who are brand new to Postman, this is like the best place to get started. And you can just get started here, and it'll kind of walk you through how to work with the challenges and use the collection. So I'm going to just add that as the final link in the chat. So for those of you who are interested in just working with Postman in general, I don't know if we have a GraphQL quick start, but we'll definitely create one soon. So this is really a great place. And then finally, I wanted to take this time to ask you to take this survey. So I believe our moderators have added that survey in the chat. So if you like this session, be sure to give us your thoughts and your questions and what you would suggest to do next. I think the next Postman Intergalactic that we have happening next month. So if you enjoyed the GraphQL session and you wanted to learn a little bit more about what else is happening in Postman, the next session that we have is all about gRPC. So we wanted to share that Postman is so much more than a client to test REST APIs. You can work with GraphQL APIs, and we're going to talk, Ian, who's the moderator on the call, will be sharing how to go about testing and developing gRPC APIs. So be sure to tune into that session, which is happening on September 27th. So with that, I think this was a lot of fun, Deba. What did you think? Did you have a good time?
Yeah, I think this was definitely fun. I enjoyed just walking through and discussing about GraphQL and all. And I hope like every other person in the audience also enjoyed it as much as I did. So yeah, it was definitely a fun one.
Yes, awesome. All right, well, be sure to take the survey and let us know what you think. But with that, I hope you guys learned something new about how to work with GraphQL using Postman. So with that, I'm gonna end the stream, and we'll see you next time. So, all right,
Bye everyone.
bye-bye, take care.